Well, it's a non-fiction day today in the Reading Corner, and helping me explore, and it literally is explore today, is Sangma Francis. We're going to call Sangma Angela today because that's her first name. And we're talking about two books that she has written for Flying Eye. One is Everest and the other is Amazon. So you can see why I said we were going exploring today. First of all, let me welcome you from your travels into the Reading Corner.
Thank you for having me, Nikki.
Tell us a little bit about your approach to writing non-fiction, and in fact, how your first commission came about.
So the first commission actually was with Flying Eye, and that one was Everest. And I had actually been working at Flying Eye as a junior copywriter. And after a few years, I'd gotten to know the editors and the team at Flying Eye quite well. And I had left at that point. And they'd approached me to say, look, we've got this book idea. Would you be interested in writing it? So obviously I said yes, but they had a few writers that they wanted to they were considering. So they'd asked me to create a writing sample. So I went away, did some research and created a sample and submitted it. And they decided to go with me, which was great.
Fabulous. Well, they're two books that I highly recommend to teachers on these subjects. I'm interested to begin with to know how you structured the book and whether that was part of the commission that you were given the structure, or whether you had to find your way through and think, what's a really good way to organise all of this rich material about Everest?
That is really interesting, because actually that is probably one of the hardest things, I think, to do with both books. And they were both very different. I mean, the way that Everest is now structured is that we start at the base of the mountain and we slowly make our way up. And as we progress up, we discover the different kind of flora and fauna and people that belong to those spaces. And it seems like an obvious way, perhaps, to structure it like that, like looking at it at the end. But at the beginning, it was so messy and we tried every which way. And I'd come in with a pile of information and loads of different, put into loads of different spreads, and it wasn't working. And so there was a lot of conversations and back and forth with the editor at the time until we settled on this. And then within that backbone of walking up the mountain, then the spreads each had their own life. That was quite painful, to be honest. So when I started on Amazon, I was much more aware that really needed to be defined more a bit earlier on, because it really does influence what you decide to put in. So the Amazon, we've done the same similar thing, starting from the source of the river and then traveling all the way to the mouth. And the chapters are split up by cities, actually. So it was Cusco, then Iquitos and Manaus, and then out to the mouth of the river. But then I went away to the Amazon on this research trip. And we realized that it didn't really work in that way, because we were trying to talk about, okay, this happens here and that happens there. It doesn't really work like that, because animals swim down the river. The distribution of trees around the river varies so widely from one place to the other. You couldn't really separate it that way. So the river forms the backbone, and that encourages this idea of connectivity, but it's split into chapters, which I think is more contained, I guess.
And of course, the great thing is that you don't notice, as a reader, all the hard work that's gone into making that so seamless. You talked about this big pile of information that you had before coming to the structure of Everest. Where did that come from?
So I order in books about the mountain itself, the expeditions, the environment there. But there's also lots of journals, scientific journals specifically for flora and fauna, especially if you want to try and tap into anything that's much more contemporary or new science or new discussions that are happening at the moment around a specific place. I watch documentaries, because I think that if you haven't been to a place, it's always very interesting to see visuals and to get a sense. And when you're looking, if you're looking at a specific animal, you're really I'm Googling, what do they sound like? What do they feel like? You're really trying to get all the pieces of information, because whether you use it or not, it might be that you want to talk about, I don't know, a deer's wet nose in a specific way because it adds a bit of color. Yeah. So it's quite a wide pool I kind of go into to find all the information.
And from there you're filtering and bearing in mind your reader. And what did you have in mind as a reader?
So the brief was, I think it was 9+ or 8+. So I stuck with that. And it's a balance with nonfiction because it has to be precise. There has to be the science behind it. So there is a kind of certain language that you have to use. But as much as I can, I try and kind of elevate it in some ways for the reader, to kind of speak directly to them. And also just try and explain some things simply as much as I can, because I know I loved English. I loved words growing up. Science was not my forte. It wasn't. I really had to kind of almost reinterpret what the science teacher was telling me in the scientific kind of like in their terms, in order to understand these concepts that I was learning. So I understand that kind of that bit of struggle, I guess, with not necessarily always getting it straight away. And I didn't want that. I wanted any reader to be able to come to it and feel that it was open to them, that the subject matter was open.
And of course, you're aided in both books by two fabulous illustrators.
I am so lucky to have been working with both these illustrators. They are absolutely amazing. Usually what happens is with both of them, I send in the first draft and then it goes through a round of edits. So I'll rework certain areas. It goes then, I guess, to the designer for layouts, and then there's a point at which the kind of rough sketches come into the layouts with the text in there, and we can kind of see how it's kind of sitting together. Actually, the text is too heavy here, and the illustration does need more space and it needs more time. So I'm happy to rework text and kind of rephrase things or even cut something right back if it needs to, if that makes the quality overall and the experience overall a lot better for the reader.
Can we just name both illustrators? So for Everest, it was
Lisk Feng.
And for Amazon?
Romulo Di Hippolito. So Romulo is actually Brazilian and Lisk is Chinese American. And I think that they're both really individual, their styles, but they kind of capture the kind of space that they're both very different, obviously the Everest and the Amazon River, but the colors that come through with the Amazon and the colors that come through with Everest, they're very, I don't know, they really conjure the kind of the feeling of what it might be like in a cold, harsh mountainous climate. And the same with the Amazon forest, which is so rich with color and it feels kind of like vibrant. And that's the thing about the Amazon, it is very vibrant, particularly with the noise. And you kind of get that somehow, or to me, you get that.
Let's talk a little bit. Let's go to the Himalayas first and talk about Everest. Yeah. So you talk, first of all, about the mountain and how the mountain got its name.
Yeah.
And I was really interested because all of the other mountains in the range have local names. Everest really sticks out because the name doesn't fit. Does it have a local name as well?
It does have a local name. So, Tibetans call her, and this is my pronunciation, which I hope I get right, Chomolungma. So it means mother goddess of the world. But we have the name Everest, and that was named after Sir George Everest, who was a Welsh surveyor. And they were kind of mapping India at the time. But it was actually discovered to be the tallest mountains by an Indian mathematician who I kind of highlight in the book. So Radhanath Sikdar. And he's the one who kind of used the kind of triangulation to figure out that Mount Everest was, the highest. And he was still about 100 miles away, which I think is insane.
Yeah. And things change their size, don't they?
Well, at the moment, it's supposed to be growing because of the way that the tectonic kind of, the plates are kind of moving. It's kind of shifting up ever so slightly and ever so slowly. So it is supposedly growing.
Right. So it's in the growth stage. You then take us into the foothills of the mountains and you talk about the alpine environment. We think about alpine as being something to do with the Alps, not to do with the Himalayas. So what's an alpine environment?
It's the tree line, which is the highest height that can sustain trees. So it's very cold and snowy, and that's kind of what we kind of think of it. You often think of, I guess, of pine trees because they can survive in that kind of landscape.
Of course, the one thing that we think about first and foremost when we think about Everest are all the attempts to climb and to conquer. And of course, one of the things I was really pleased to see in your book, and I think it is true that perhaps this is more the case, is a much stronger recognition for the role of the Sherpa.
Yes.
Tenzing Norgay,
yes.
in particular, with that ascent with Edmund Hillary.
Yeah.
So much so that you put his name first.
Yes. Yeah. I was very, very conscious of that, actually, because I've been reading biographies and books about the kind of the first expedition. And I suppose because there's so much documentation from the English teams and the Swiss teams and the French teams, they've kind of kept diaries, and the focus of the lens was on, like, you know, their national kind of players. So a lot of the stories centered around them, but actually the Sherpas played such a significant role. And for me, it was really important that they were kind of treated as equals, at the very least, within these texts. And so, yeah, I put his name first. And I also wanted to end the passage and spread on a quote from Tenzing. And the idea that you kind of talked about conquering the mountain, I think that was very much the approach for a lot of these climbers. It's the idea of conquering and being the first to the top. Whereas I think for the Sherpas, there was far more kind of respect. It wasn't about conquering the mountain and such in that way. And so once they reached the top, he says, "At that great moment, the mountain did not seem to me a lifeless thing of snow and ice, but warm and friendly and living." And I think that kind of really sums up what the mountain is. It is this kind of living entity with life on it that needs to be thought of with that kind of respect.
So there's climbing the mountain, and I think you discovered quite a lot as well about the mythology of the mountain, and it's very tied into religion of local people as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
When we first came to the book, we were looking at a place, but we wanted to kind of give a 360-degree kind of view of it. It wasn't just, you know, the animals and the plant life, it's the people, it's the culture, it's the history. And whilst it's nonfiction, I think that our relationship to the natural world is very much tied into stories, and some of those are based in myths and legends and local folklore. And it helps us to kind of understand our relationship to the world. And also the stories are so inventive, like it's a real celebration of the kind of human creativity as well, I think. For me, nonfiction is kind of, it's not just facts and a list of information. It kind of helps you understand your own position in the world somehow. It kind of colors in other parts of the world, and therefore allows you to kind of find your shape within that.
It's interesting because in the Dewey Decimal System in the libraries, myth will be found under non-fiction.
Oh, really?
So it can be told, because it's obviously way back, it's related to people's religious beliefs as well. And so to treat that as fiction is often seen as disrespectful to that particular culture and belief.
Yeah, it makes sense.
I want to talk a little bit about Everest now, because since those days of the sort of early 20th century and all of the people that were climbing the mountain, determined to be the first to get to the top, well, since then it's become a bit of a tourist. Well, you know, you have to work hard at it. You do, but there are many people climbing the mountain now.
Yeah.
What impact is that having?
I guess it's the same as any kind of space which is kind of overcrowded and overpopulated and doesn't have the infrastructure to kind of support that. The sheer volume of people does mean that there is a lot of rubbish kind of left behind on the mountain. And that can cause huge problems, especially if we're talking about things like human feces and anything that can decay, because when it freezes over and if it was to wash back down the mountain into kind of water sources, it can cause huge hygiene risks and problems and health problems for populations living further down. I mean, there are structures and organizations and kind of incentives in place to encourage climbers to take their things back, but it's something that to be really mindful of, because you have to be very conscious of your impact.
Well, Amazon was a little different in as much as you did partway through the process
Yes.
get to visit.
I
So
know.
maybe I can start with your visit to, it was Brazil, wasn't it?
It was Brazil, yes. It was amazing. It was part of a program, a residency through Lab Verde and IMPA, which is the National Institute for Amazonian Research. And they invite artists and scientists to talk and have discussions around the climate, around the Amazon forest, around biodiversity. And the artists respond to that and create artworks to kind of reinterpret the kind of science or the information. And it was incredible. Like, there were some amazing people that were there with me at the same time. But the forest itself is something like I've never felt so small in my entire life. And I remember, like, I think it was very early on, we had gone up the Queer, it was like one of the tributaries to a research reserve. And we'd gone on an expedition into the forest, and the guide had kind of said, look, whatever happens, do not leave. Like, do not go off to the toilet or see something and wander away. Because from here to Colombia, it's a pristine forest. There you will get lost, and the chances of finding you are nil. And you really, well, maybe not nil, but, very, very small. And so you're just like, oh my God, it's not like wandering in a forest on Dartmoor and in an hour you'll get to an A road. It's an enormous, dense place, but everything's huge. And I think one of the things that struck me on top of this kind of this feeling of just being absolutely tiny is also the noise that was there. There is real cacophony of sounds constantly. Like in the water, you're hearing the plop and slap of something lurking there, and there's frogs along the banks, and it's constant kind of bird sound and cicadas. And when it rains, because it rains throughout every day a little bit, it's like almost drumming, huge plops of water slapping against leaves. So it's just you're really immersed in this space, which is, I guess, a humbling experience to be in that space.
Mm-hmm. You then came back and you obviously tweaked the text that had been written at that time.
Yeah.
And the book ends up in 4 sections, from source to sea, wildlife, people of the rainforest, and then life on the river.
Yeah.
So I discovered lots of new things in this book. I hadn't realised, for instance, about the different types of water and the different colours of water.
I know.
Tell us a bit about that.
I know. That, I think, is incredible. I mean, you can see it in action. So when you go to Manaus, which is in Brazil, you come to a place called the Meeting of the Waters, and that's where you have the confluence of 2 rivers coming together. And different waters, you have clear water, black water, and white water. So they're defined by the kind of the nutrient mineral content and the speed and temperatures. And it kind of gives the water a different quality, which in turn encourages different wildlife, it encourages different trees. So it's a really important to the things around it, as well as what it looks like. When you see it come together, it's this clash of these caramelly, toffee kind of water trickling through, and this really dark, almost like Coca-Cola, clashing together, but slowly moving. And eventually they kind of join and kind of filter that out and widen out to the source. But that was something new to me as well. Really incredible. And to understand how that balance works as well, because the black water, it comes from when the forests are flooded and a lot of old decaying leaf matter falls in, and it causes that kind of black color and a lot of acidity in the water. And that in turn affects the kind of fish that might be in there, then therefore the larger mammals, and therefore also the trees, because trees require different types of nutrient and different types of water, or it encourages different types. So it was just even that small fact, which is also the kind of, the bedrock of the river, was super important. I found out so much information. I loved it.
I know. And then the other thing that I hadn't come across before was the notion of 3 rivers, like the Air River. Tell us more about that, because that's absolutely fascinating too.
So we've got the so obviously the Amazon River, which kind of flows out and everyone can see, and underground, I think it was 6 kilometers underground. There is a river called the Hamza River, and that flows very, very slowly, but the other way. And then on top of the Amazon, there's essentially they call it the flying river or the aerial river. And it's basically when the trees are essentially transpiring. So kind of breathing in all of this liquid and then kind of expelling it. And as they're doing that, it's all kind of rising up and twisting around. And it creates this kind of very heavy, moist water kind of system, which is airborne. And that has a huge impact, across the whole of South America. And if we think of the Amazon, we often talk about the Amazon being very important because the trees itself soak up so much carbon, but they also expel so much water, and it kind of has a huge impact on the kind of the health essentially of the entire planet.
Of course, you talk a lot about the wildlife, and there's so much there that's of interest. But I'm just going to pick out one thing that I'd not come across before, a paradoxical frog.
Oh, yes. So it starts as a large tadpole, but over the course of its life, it becomes smaller in size. I mean, there are some crazy creatures, or what we think of as crazy, but there's an entire logic to any animal, any tree, any shrub, any flower. And they really are, really fascinating. I mean, researching this book, this was one of, many different amphibians, and really having to choose. It's like, wow, how, which one?
What animals did you see when you were there that really fascinated you?
So in the wild, I saw pink river dolphin, and I thought that was, well, when I first read about them, I was surprised because I didn't actually know that there were river dolphins. I kind of had always assumed that dolphins were kind of saltwater, and they are actually pink. And they're pink because their skin is slightly translucent, so you see the blood vessels. So in the wild, I'd seen the pink river dolphins, but we'd also, just outside of Manaus, there was a kind of nature reserve, and they had a tank that had the otters and manatees in captivity, because both are kind of endangered animals. So it's a kind of process of keeping them in captivity in order to be able to reintroduce them into the wild at some point. And seeing these otters, I think they're quite terrifying, especially when you see them eat fish. They're really, because they're so big. Well, an otter, like a giant otter in the Amazon, can go up to 1.8 meters tall, which is taller than me.
I mean, I'm those cute little things to bring up bright water. And
I know, like cutely floating on their back and kind of looking quite cuddly. No, they're massive, and they're eating their fish. They've got these kind of really big teeth and like tearing away at the flesh, and you think, oh my God, I don't think I would swim in water with otters.
You discover, or you talk quite a bit about the people who have lived along the river.
Yes.
What evidence do we have of the sort of pre-Columbian times and the people that lived there?
So this is really interesting, and this is actually one of the lectures that we had when we were in the when I was in Brazil. It was by a professor called Charles Clements, and he talked a lot about kind of debunking this myth, essentially, that the Amazon, pre-colonial kind of Europeans kind of arriving, being a space which is completely uninhabited, because it is this very dense forest, and it's very difficult to understand how you could possibly live there. People assumed that it was just this empty space. But actually, there's all sorts of technology now which can kind of like scan the topography of the forest and have a look below and see how the earth has formed certain patterns, I suppose, that kind of indicate that there were societies living there. Another one of them is looking at the actual trees. There are certain areas where you would have, and the forest itself also actually, a much higher density of certain fruit trees or trees that are very useful to humans. One of them being, for example, the peach palm, which can be used like where the fronds are braided together. It can be used as a sort of rope or as thatching to make baskets and houses. And the hypothesis is that in order to have that so many trees like that, they would have had to be cultivated to some extent. So people would have actually at that point planted more of these trees because they were very useful. Another thing is obviously with trees that are particularly tasty for humans. If you are to be eating some of the seeds and depositing the seeds in areas, they are going to also grow naturally from your kind of waste, essentially. So there's been, like, you know, the estimate is about 6 million, I think 5 to 6 million people they estimate to have lived in the forest pre-Columbian. So pre-Columbian meaning like pre-Christopher Columbus coming across the Americas, which is incredible.
Absolutely fascinating. Yeah. Well, that is literally scraping the surface, but hopefully has given listeners enough to think that these are books that are worth dipping into. And it's been such a pleasure talking to you. So thank you so much, Angela.
Thank you. It's been really lovely talking to you.
In the Reading Corner is presented by Nikki Gamble and produced by Alison Hughes. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review. If you would like to find out about other events and courses, visit justimagine.co.uk. Join us again in the Reading Corner on your favourite podcast platform.